The last decade has been a difficult one for the European Union. In the wake of the 2009 debt crisis, much debate has arisen around its nature, its powers, its governance and its policies. The situation got worse when the migrant inflow boomed in 2015, triggering an EU-level crisis. In this strained socio-economic context, diverging views on the EU as a polity have emerged at the political level both inside the single member states and inside the organisation's institutions. Recently, two events have revived the debate once more. The first is the re-election of Viktor Orban, a prominent conservative and Eurosceptic politician, as Prime Minister of Hungary. The second is the statement by France's President Emmanuel Macron that the EU is facing a civil war on its fundamental values, resulting from different opinions between its Western and Central Eastern member states. This affirmation seems exaggerated, at least at first glance, but in such a turbulent political context, it raises a legitimate question: is the EU on the edge of civil war? I'm Kasim, welcome to KJ Vids, and in this video we will talk about if the European Union is on the edge of a civil war. To answer this question, the first thing we need to do is to determine in which conditions a civil war starts. Essentially, this happens when two or more socio-political groups belonging to the same political entity disagree on the existing and/or future institutional order, and being unable or unwilling to peacefully find a compromise through the existing institutional mechanisms, opt for armed conflict to impose their view and determine who will reshape the existing order by the use of coercion. Usually, a civil war opposes one group fighting to preserve the standing institutional framework, along with the prerogatives it enjoys thanks to it, and another group who wants to dismantle it and set up a new order more favourable to its interests. That said, history is full of examples of civil wars, from those which paved the way to the end of the Roman Republic centuries ago, to the ongoing conflicts in Syria and Yemen, but one is particularly significant due to its similarities with the situation the EU is facing today, which is the American Civil War. The US Civil War, also known as a War of Secession, was an armed conflict that split the United States between 1861 and 1865. The two contenders were the Union, which was the North, formed by states that remained loyal to the government of the United States, and the other was the Confederacy in the South, which was made up of states that seceded from the US and formed a separate political entity known as the Confederate States of America. Usually this war is portrayed as a fight over the issue of slavery, with the Union supporting its abolishment and the Confederacy favourable to its preservation. But even though slavery was indeed a central issue in sparking the conflict, the situation was far more complex than a clear-cut black versus white clash between conservative and progressist ideals. As a matter of fact, there were also major political, judicial, institutional and economic factors linked to the debate over slavery and human rights. To understand this, it is necessary to perform a rapid historical overview on the prelude to the conflict. After being recognised as a sovereign polity by the Paris Treaty that officially ended the War of Independence in 1783, the United States began developing and expanding to the west. Rapidly, new states were founded and admitted to the Union, but the economic outlook of the member states started diverging. Those located in the north embraced industrialisation, whereas the states in the south remained essentially agricultural. Their rich landlords owned vast plantations and exploited a large workforce of black slaves to work for them. With time, this north-south gap became more and more marked, and it ultimately assumed a political dimension as well. As a matter of fact, the northern states needed cheap manpower to sustain their rapid industrialisation. The mass of black slaves living in the south was the ideal solution, but it was impossible to hire them since they were a private property of the southern landowners. Consequently, the North states started calling for slavery to be abolished, provoking the firm opposition of the Southerners who needed slaves to cultivate the plantations that were the base of their local economy. Besides, the two sides also diverged over trade policies. The North wanted protectionist measures to shelter its developing industry, while the South supported free trade as a means to continue exporting its agricultural products abroad. This led to an intense constitutional debate over slavery and ultimately over the power of the federal government to introduce and enforce legislation on the matter all over the US territory. Again, the opinion diverged between the North and the South. Essentially, the former claimed that the central government had this authority, whereas the latter considered this as a violation of the constitutional limitations on the powers of the federal institutions. So the debate took a dimension that went beyond the issue of slavery and focused on the nature of the US as a polity. The Union favoured a strong central government having large powers, while the Confederates defended the rights and prerogatives of the single member states. The combination of all these factors finally led them to secede from the US in 1861 and form an alternative polity, the Confederate States of America. The name itself is significant, as it reveals the different way these states interpreted their constitution and conceived America as a political entity. They wanted a confederation, a polity granting more powers to the member states, in contrast to a federation where the central authorities have larger constitutional competences. Now, there are striking similarities between the situation of the US before the Civil War and that of the EU today. The latter has also expanded during the previous decades by admitting new member states, with the most important enlargement wave taking place in 2004 with Central and Eastern European countries, and the most recent new member being Croatia, which joined the organisation in 2013. Again, similarly to America at the eve of the Civil War, the EU is also facing an intense debate over human rights that has greater economic, political and constitutional implications. There is not a proper EU constitution, but the general sense of the term is still applicable to the treaties at the base of the EU. In this context, two camps are identifiable, the complexity of reality notwithstanding. One is formed by the original or at least more ancient members of the EU, concentrated in Western Europe, whilst the other includes the more recent ones located in the central eastern part of the continent, and whose core is made up of the four countries forming the Visegrad Group: Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, also known as the V4. The starting point to understand the divergence between these two factions is the migration crisis. As a matter of fact, the former group is demanding the Central Eastern partners to accept a larger share of migrants, but the Visegrad states oppose these requests. As in the 1850s America, the issue is not merely humanitarian, since there are economic and political reasons behind the respective positions. Countries like Italy, Greece and others, including France and Germany to some degree, worry that the migrant flow will put their socio-economic order under stress and that it may hamper the sluggish recovery from the recent debt crisis. In contrast, the V4 and other states oppose such policies of migrant redistribution because they may slow down their ongoing economic development. But the divergence is also a matter of past experiences. Western countries have a long tradition of immigration from abroad, often as a consequence of their colonial past, and their societies are more used to the presence of foreigners, thus explaining their softer stance on immigration. This is not the case of Central Eastern European states, that therefore prefer stricter measures in regard to immigration. Finally, similarly to America before the Civil War, the current debate in the EU also has a prominent institutional dimension. This can be explained from a historical perspective. Countries from the western part of the continent took their current form as a result of a centralization process, which makes them more willing to accept devolving parts of their sovereignty to a supranational entity like the EU. That is why, in spite of mounting Eurosceptic forces, they remain favourable to further European integration, especially in the case of France, that appears willing to become the driver of deeper integration through devolving more powers to supranational institutions and by creating a true fiscal union, even though this met resistance from Germany. On the contrary, the Visegrad states and those aligned with them oppose strengthening the powers of the EU institutions and want to preserve their fundamental sovereign rights. The reason for this lies in their past. These countries arose after the collapse of larger multinational polities affected by severe institutional deficiencies, and also had a long history of foreign domination and meddling, which ended only in 1991 with the fall of the Soviet Union. As a result, they see the EU as another cumbersome supranational entity that will put them in a subordinate position and are therefore unwilling to devolve more powers to it. This underlying contrast over the powers of European institutions is the most important aspect in the current debate, because it will have a direct repercussion over the future of the EU. Now, the problem is that while opinions are discordant amongst the member states, the complex institutional mechanisms of the EU do not facilitate the search for a compromise. Introducing deep changes both in the sense of increased integration and of more protection over the state's sovereignty requires a revision of the treaties that form the bloc's constitution. But in turn, this demands a long and multi-stage procedure where reaching a consensus is hard and where a single wrong step can block the entire process. Think of the French and Dutch referendum that sunk the proposed constitutional treaty in 2005. Considering that the divergences are growing, finding a common agreement over the EU, its powers and its values may be impossible, and this could lead to an institutional stalemate. So what then? Will the EU plunge into a civil war as the US did in the past? Not necessarily. Modern day European states and their societies are strongly averse to war, which is already a huge safeguard against extreme solutions. And if it is true that European powers have been fighting themselves for centuries, it is also true that the EU was established after the trauma of World War II, also as a means to put a definite end to that continuous bloodshed. Moreover, in spite of its slowness and difficulties, the EU proved capable to adapt and preserve itself during the past. In most cynic terms, since the EU is not a state, even if one or more of its members decide to unilaterally secede, it will not have its own military means to enforce its rule and reunite them as the Union eventually did with the Confederates in 1965. Finally, this scenario is unlikely for the simple fact that the Treaty on the European Union, Article 50, contains provisions allowing a member state to withdraw, as the United Kingdom decided to do after the 2016 vote on Brexit. But it is exactly a mass Brexit-like scenario that can raise concerns over the long-term tenure of the EU. A full-scale civil war seems unlikely, unless the international situation becomes so severely deteriorated in economic and political terms to bring states to the point of using war to secure their interests. But if the existing divergences continue to mount and no solution is reached, then it is still possible that some member states, most likely the V4 ones, will decide to leave the EU. The consequences are difficult to predict, ranging from an easier path to greater integration between the remaining like-minded members to a dissolution of the organisation. In any case, the EU would be weakened at the international level, possibly leaving room for alternative blocs. All this would bring uncertainty in political and economic terms, and especially if the EU were dismantled. It would certainly be a turning point in European history, as the Civil War was in Americas. Thanks for watching another KJ vid, and I hope you enjoyed it. We would like to especially thank our contributor Alex Gagiridis, who conducted the research and analysis for this video and helped produce it in collaboration with KJ Vids. Please don't forget to support our crowdfunding campaign on fundmypage.com or join our Patreon program where you can get perks for our content. You may also browse our book collection on our website kjvids.co.uk. Finally, if you would like to sponsor a KJ video, you can do so via fundmyvideo.com. Thanks for watching again, and see you next time.